everyone, welcome to episode 42 of our weekly CRICKETher Vodcast. And in today's episode, we are going to be looking ahead to 2021 and seeing what we think it might bring and what it might not bring. But first of all, we thought that we might do a little bit more of looking back at 2020, continuing from last week's episode, and in the style of Sid's favourite political journalist, which is Stephen Bush for the New Statesman, in case you didn't know, so that gives away some of Sid's politics there. We are going to be looking at predictions we made and things that we got wrong. What mistakes did we make? We've been reviewing some of our old videos and thinking about that. So Sid, what mistakes did you make and how do you reflect on them now at the start of the new year?
Well, I think the key mistake I need to own up to, Raf, for having reviewed the old videos, is that I really should have had a haircut much sooner.
So true. I did try and tell you, but you know.
More seriously, I think that one key mistake that I made was to kind of underestimate the power of the regional competition from the start, really. That I had a little bit of locked-in scepticism about the regional competition in general because I was disappointed about the end of the county championship, and I was very sceptical about the ECB's ability to deliver it, just in terms of having to face down all the issues with the COVID-19 crisis. And that scepticism was not right. The ECB delivered. The people at the ECB worked incredibly hard to get that competition actually run, and it was a really good competition, and I absolutely thoroughly enjoyed it. As I said in last week's episode, it was one of my highlights of the year, and I was wrong to be so sceptical on all those counts. So that's me. What about you, Raf? What do you look back on and want to review?
Well, I think the theme of mine is World Cups, really. So first up, months ago in March, I had a look at our little video that we did right before the World Cup final, and I predicted that India were going to win, which was obviously wrong. So, and quite spectacularly wrong, really, if you look back at the final. But I do stick by what I said about, I think that India played better throughout the duration of the tournament than Australia did. But unfortunately, I guess, given where we are with COVID, it looks like that might be a bit of an aberration in terms of India actually going into that final, in my head, as the team that had been performing more consistently in the preceding weeks. So that was one thing. Another thing that I think that to some extent we were both guilty of was actually being a bit too, or we both said that we thought that the 2021 50 over World Cup in New Zealand would go ahead. And we were fairly convinced of that because New Zealand and the New Zealand government seemed to have been handling the pandemic very well, very early on. And so we both thought that it was more likely than not that the 50 over World Cup would go ahead as planned in February 2021. And we were wrong about that because it's obviously been postponed by a year. And actually, thinking about it and kind of reflecting on that, it does feel to me that was probably the right move. If you think about where we are now, it's January, we're probably about 6 weeks away from where the original 50 over World Cup would have been starting, and given the situation globally, it feels like to actually launch a World Cup in 6 weeks' time would have just been a bit of a non-starter, doesn't it? I mean, I know that the British government have handled things particularly badly, but we're back at the peak of where we were in the first wave, really, aren't we? And the idea of anyone making it over to New Zealand for a cricket World Cup right now just feels, the kind of the realms of fantasy land, doesn't it? So and I guess the other thing is that what we did say in our videos was that we feared that the 2021 World Cup would be to some extent a damp squib, in the sense of it would all have to have been played maybe with very limited crowds, but more likely behind closed doors, and certainly with no overseas fans and no overseas journalists. And actually the hope, of course, is that by delaying it by a year, it will be able to take place kind of in much more normal circumstances. So yes, we did get that one wrong, but I'm kind of glad we did get that one wrong, if I'm allowed to say that. So that's our looking back at our wrong predictions in 2020. But let's now look ahead to 2021 and have a think about what that might bring. And we've had a bit of news this week which relates to some of the difficulties that we might still encounter in 2021. So there's been some news about the WNCL in Australia, hasn't there, Sid?
Yeah, so WNCL, which is Australia's equivalent of our regionals competition, I suppose. It's their state competition, it's their big 50 over competition. It's the only key high level 50 over cricket that the players play in Australia at the highest level. And that was scheduled to start off the weekend after next, around about the 15th. And it's looking like that's in trouble because there are travel restrictions being imposed in response to the virus kind of kicking off again in Australia. Now, kicking off in Australia in a very small way compared to, unfortunately, the way it is here. But Australian state governments are imposing travel restrictions which look like potentially clobbering the opening couple of rounds at least. And we'll have to see where we go with that. Cricket Australia have announced, they've said, we acknowledge that there might be issues here, but they haven't really said what they're going to do about it. I suspect that, they probably don't have the budget to run it as a proper, biosecure competition the way that they did with WBBL. So we're probably looking at just cutting weekends out of the competition, unfortunately, and we'll have to see where that leaves us. But I suspect that it might wind up being, 2 or 3 rounds only, and then, qualification for a final by net run rate or something. That could be where that winds up going. So that would be a pity if that was the case, because Australia so far has largely avoided disruption to their cricket. But unfortunately, there was more disruption announced for them as well this week on an international level, wasn't there? Because even as India's men are currently on tour in Australia, there was news about the potential series between India's women and Australia's women.
Yes, so India women were meant to be touring there in January, so in the coming weeks, and that has been officially postponed in inverted commas. So yes, it's going to apparently happen in the next Australian summer, sort of end 2021, early 2022 apparently, as a kind of extended tour, although whether that actually happens is anyone's guess, but that's what they've said. And as you point out, the Indian men's team are there at the moment, but apparently because women are women, therefore it's clearly impossible for the women to get on a plane and travel to Australia. They just don't have the right equipment or whatever you might say there.
I wonder if
Cricket Australia's justification for this is the impact of the global pandemic made it necessary to postpone until next season. So it's the vaguest, most kind of sort of esoteric reason that they could possibly give is basically just it's COVID's fault. And that to me is a terrible justification, I'm afraid. I think I actually tweeted saying the year is 2040. Somewhere around the globe, a cricket board is saying we have unfortunately had to postpone our next bilateral women's series because of the impact of the coronavirus pandemic 20 years ago. So it just strikes me as a bit of a lame excuse, to be honest.
Yeah, I wonder if what we're actually seeing here is something that we alluded to a couple of weeks ago, that the real impact of coronavirus in terms of its impact upon organised sport and things actually is yet to happen. The real impact comes when people get together going into this year and start to look at their budgets and realise that the bottom line has significantly shifted and they need to make far more severe cuts than they might have hoped, and that might be what this is related to. So, well, if
the two richest cricket boards in the world can't organise a bilateral series between their women's teams, then I really genuinely fear for what the next 12 months is going to mean in terms of bilateral cricket.
Yeah, and there are very few other bilateral series on the horizon, are there, Raf? Because the whole bilateral environment of women's international cricket has been governed by the ICC Women's Championship, and what's going on there? Not a lot, because we're in the middle, or we're in between cycles, as it were.
Well, exactly that, exactly. So if you look at the next 12 months, what we've actually got in the schedule, as far as confirmed fixtures go, well, we know that Pakistan are going to tour South Africa in the very foreseeable future. In the very near future. But other than that, I don't think that there are any other officially confirmed bilateral series. We've obviously got the 50-over World Cup qualifiers taking place in Sri Lanka in June, I think it is. And then we will start to see the T20 qualifiers taking place on a regional basis, beginning with the European qualifier in Scotland in August. So those fixtures are confirmed. But in terms of bilateral cricket, there isn't really anything else, is there?
Yeah, we've got England allegedly travelling to New Zealand, but there's actually been no formal announcements of that. Everything that we've heard about that has been, notes passed under the table. Some of the newspapers alluded to Australia joining that as something that might happen, but also might not happen. So it's all very much up in the air, unfortunately.
And the ECB have said that they think that they're going to be hosting South Africa and New Zealand this summer, but we don't have any confirmed dates. I read just this morning that there's talk of Sri Lanka, Bangladesh and Pakistan, I think it is, playing a tri-series in Sri Lanka just before the 50-over World Cup qualifying tournament, which kind of makes sense from a logistical perspective, given that those three teams will be in the country anyway for the qualifiers. But again, if you look at ESPN, CRICKETher's, their schedule for the coming year, and you look at the planned fixtures, I'm afraid as far as women's cricket goes, the cupboard is rather bare, and that is a concern. And as you say, what it does is effectively launches us back to the situation we were in 6 or 7 years ago, before they launched this ICC Women's Championship, which is effectively, as well as being the qualifying programme for the World Cup, for the 50-over World Cup, is also a future tours programme for women's cricket, which for many years we didn't have. And so that meant that year on year you didn't know who was going to be touring where, and there were countries who were going between World Cups with playing barely any ODIs at all. And we're kind of back in that scenario now, in the sense of there's no impetus for cricket boards to organise these fixtures, to organise these bilateral series, and as you say, in a time when budgets are stretched because of COVID, what we're seeing is that without that impetus, it's there's no incentive to organise cricket, and so therefore we're going to end up with months on end with teams not playing, and that is generally quite worrying, I think.
Yeah, and it kind of brings back all those worries that we've had ongoing about the fact that essentially women's cricket is governed by people whose main priority is not women's cricket. It's governed mostly by people whose main priority is men's test cricket, or perhaps men's limited overs cricket in some cases, or T20 cricket even. But, it's that common word, men's cricket remains the priority, unfortunately.
Yeah. So, that's a happy start to the new year. But at the very least, at least we know that come August we can be driving up the A1 into Scotland, hence our background today, which the keen-eyed Scottish viewers may be familiar with, and we may well be heading up there in August.
Somewhere around here.
Heading up there in August to watch some of the qualifiers. Let's keep our fingers crossed for that, and fingers crossed for good weather as well. So there's always things to look forward to, and you never know, maybe all of our predictions in this video will be proved wrong as well. That's the way the cookie crumbles. Anyway, Happy New Year, and see you in a week's time. Bye for now.
Bye.